Critics and people have been abusing this film. Here's my thoughts. For those of you that watch my reviews on a consistent basis, I apologize for getting this one out so late. I saw it on Friday, but I've been busy with work and stuff, so here it is now. The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey is directed by Peter Jackson, who made the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which was obviously adapted from the series of 3 books by Tolkien. Many years before Tolkien wrote the Lord of the Rings trilogy, he wrote a little book called The Hobbit, which is what Peter Jackson is now making into not 1, but 3 movies. And I'll address my thoughts on that one later. The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey tells the story of a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins, who you might recognize from the Lord of the Rings series, and 13 dwarves and Mr. Gandalf the Grey. But at one point in time, the city was attacked by a greedy dragon named Smaug, who pretty much obliterated the city and took the mountain for himself, killing a lot of the dwarves and driving the rest of them out of the city. The movie and the book tell the story of the 13 dwarves, the hobbit, and the wizard that go to reclaim this city from the dragon Smaug. This film has caused a lot of debate for multiple reasons, but one of them being that it was shot in 48 frames per second. Normal movies are shot in 24 frames per second, which gives it that cinematic look. And Peter Jackson decided to film this one in 48 frames per second because Peter Jackson believes that the 48 frames per second will give the movie a much clearer look and will be a lot easier on the eyes, especially when it comes to 3D. There's a lot of reasons for why he did it. If any of you have a high-definition television that has the feature Auto Motion Plus, I think is what it is, that's kind of what the 48 frames per second looks like. It's weird. I have a friend who has a television that looks like that, and it bugs the crap out of me. I can't stand it. So I did not see this movie in 48 frames per second. Everything looks really crystal clear, but it loses that cinematic feel, and I didn't want the 48 frames per second to ruin my first theater experience with The Hobbit, so I saw it in 24 and paid $6 to see it instead of $15. Here's a little background on my thoughts of all things Middle-earth. The first film in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Fellowship of the Ring, came out in 2001. I was 7. When I got a little older, I went back and watched all the films, and I really liked them, but I wasn't a huge fanboy or anything. I owned all 3 of the films on DVD until about a month ago when Jeremy Jahns came out with his review of the entire series. His review over the whole series really reminded me of how much I enjoyed the films. So I went to Best Buy and bought the entire extended edition set on Blu-ray and watched the entire thing, all 12 hours of it. And I officially adore this series. It's so good. I finished the entire trilogy like a week and a half before The Hobbit came out, and I didn't want to leave Middle-earth, so I went and picked up The Hobbit and read through the entire book before I went to see the film. I've never prepared more for a movie than I did this one. But I don't regret it one bit because I think the fact that I read this book made me enjoy The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey a whole lot more than I would have if I hadn't read it. I'm going to go ahead and say it, I really love this movie. For my review, I'm going to respond to a lot of the complaints I've heard about this film. The biggest complaint I've heard from all kinds of people is that the first hour and a half of this film is just dead slow. Originally, Peter Jackson wanted to make The Hobbit into 2 films, but instead we're getting 3. And when I originally heard that, I thought, money! But after reading the book, I have a different perspective on that matter. I think that The Hobbit skims over a lot of material really quickly. They go to Rivendell in the book and you're like, awesome, Rivendell, and 1 page later they're gone. And you're like, oh, moving on, I guess. Another thing is, in the book, when huge battle sequences occur that can be stretched out into 15-20 minute sequences in a movie, they can literally be summed up in an entire paragraph in the book and just move on with what's happening. And then the battle began. One thing led to another, and thousands were dead and they moved on with their lives. That can be extended into a 25-minute sequence in the movie. So I really think that there's plenty of material in the book to be made into 3 movies. And I'm happy that we have 3 movies to watch. I have no complaints about that. And another thing is, Peter Jackson's not just pulling from The Hobbit itself. In the book, one of the characters mentions this necromancer that lives south of Mirkwood Forest, I believe. It's literally one line in The Hobbit. And when I read that line, I was like, wait, no, go to the south. I want to read that story. I read somewhere online, I don't know if this is true or not, I read it on the internet, that Tolkien had a book of unfinished tales, and in those unfinished tales, the story of the necromancer was told, and so I think Peter Jackson's pulling from that. The whole sequence with the necromancer character is introduced in this movie, and people had a lot of complaints with it because they were like, what does that have anything to do with the story? Apparently it leads to some really awesome stuff that we'll see in the next few movies, and they just had to set it up in this movie, and so people had a lot of complaints with that. As long as it leads to something relevant, I have no problem with them setting it up in this movie. Anyways, back to the pacing of this film before I went on that whole little tangent. Almost 30 minutes of this movie at the beginning of the film take place in Bilbo's house. It's when they introduce all of the characters and why they're going on this journey, and it takes some time. There's some really great moments in that whole sequence, and it was cool to see all of these characters that I love from the book on screen, but a lot of it could have been cut out, and I understand why people are complaining about that. The whole first hour of this film's got a lot of stuff that people who have read the books will really enjoy. But people who haven't read the book will probably find things a little bit out of place and will find it a little bit slow. I know I'm comparing the movie to the book a whole lot, but because I read the book so recently, it really enhanced my experience. And so a lot of complaints that people had about the pacing and the plot didn't bother me as much. Here's a list of some good things about this movie. The acting is all really great. You've got Ian McKellen, who obviously kills it as Gandalf. Martin Freeman was perfectly casted as Bilbo. He really does a good job of portraying that character in this movie. And then Richard Armitage as Thorin. I didn't know his name until about 2 seconds ago. He was really good as Thorin, who basically is the leader of the pack of dwarves, and he's also the heir to the throne. And so he plays a pretty major role in this story, and so it was important that he was casted well, and he was. And then of course you've got Andy Serkis, who just dominates as Gollum. The scene with Gollum and the riddles in the dark is one of my favorite scenes in the book and also in this movie. It was so well done. That was one phenomenal sequence, and props to Andy Serkis and Martin Freeman for pulling that one off. People are giving Peter Jackson a lot of crap for this movie, for what he did with 48 frames per second, things like that. A lot of people are going into this movie expecting the same really dark, gritty tone of The Lord of the Rings. But it's not The Lord of the Rings, it's The Hobbit. Yes, it takes place in Middle-earth, but it's a totally different time, and it has a completely different tone. It's a lot more cheerful, and it's more like a childhood fairy tale than the Lord of the Rings series is. I just think that Peter Jackson did a really good job of giving the story of The Hobbit a darker tone and making it a little bit more interesting for those of us that like The Lord of the Rings a lot. Now, in no way is this movie a perfect movie. It's definitely got some faults. I'm not the only one that disliked this character. He's mentioned like once in The Hobbit. He's not actually in the story of The Hobbit, but they decided to make him a little bit bigger in this movie. Radagast the Brown. But he's a wizard that has some fairly lame powers, that lives out in the middle of the woods, and he's a tad bit eccentric. But in the movie, they just go way over the top with it. He's literally only in this movie about 5 minutes, but there's literally lines that I was just rolling my eyes at how just ridiculously over the top they were. He's talking to Gandalf, and he's like, but then I went, but that was honestly too much. The guy rides on a sled that's pulled by rabbits. People are calling him the Jar Jar Binks of Middle-earth, and he's pretty bad, but he only has like 5 minutes of screen time, so I don't know if you can go quite that far. But almost every time that he was on screen, I was just like, ugh. Way too over the top with that character, and I hope he doesn't get more screen time than he did in this one. It was not good. Another issue that I had with the film is how silly some of the characters looked. There's a lot of CGI in this movie, and I hear it's really rough to look at if you're seeing it in the 48 frames, because it looks really fake. I saw it in the 24 frames, so the CGI as a whole didn't bother me as much, but there are certain dwarves that look just kind of ridiculous, especially the really fat dwarf. I think is it Bombor? I don't remember which one it is. Like, he's balding in one little spot of his head, which is fine, but he's got like orange hair, and he's got like this really giant chin, and he just looks silly. And in the book, they make fun of him a lot, so he is supposed to be kind of this character that's a little bit silly, but sometimes he went over the top, and I think just like the makeup of his character just didn't do it for me. I don't know what it was. When characters look kind of silly, it's harder to take them seriously, and so it can take me out of the movie, and in this movie, it did a few times. Overall, I thought The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey was a solid film. Even though it doesn't quite attain the level of awesomeness that is the Lord of the Rings trilogy, it's definitely a solid welcome back to Middle-earth. I'm going to give The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey a 90 out of 100. In case you're wondering how that matches up with my ratings for the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Return of the King 97, Fellowship 96, Two Towers 94. So, there you go. The Hobbit isn't as good as the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but it's still a solid film, and I was very happy with it. I didn't go see it in 48 frames per second, so I had no problems with that. I didn't have any problems with the running time, and I think Peter Jackson did a really solid job of adapting that novel to film. As far as who should go see this movie, I think if you're a fan of the Lord of the Rings, you've probably already seen this, and you should have already seen this movie by now. But if you haven't seen the other Lord of the Rings films, I definitely think you should watch those first before seeing this one. And if you don't like the Lord of the Rings movies, you're not going to like this one, so I don't think it's worth your time and money. And if you haven't gone to see it yet, I really recommend going to see it in 24 frames per second. It'll save you some money, and I think you'll probably enjoy it more the first time in 24 frames per second, so do that. Anyways, that's my review of The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey. If you enjoyed this review, subscribe to my channel and go check out some of my other movie reviews, and like this video below. Also, comment below and let me know what your thoughts are on the 48 frames per second business, what your thoughts are on The Hobbit as a movie, because despite how long this video is, I know that there's some things that I still have to say, and I'm going to remember them as soon as I turn off that camera. Anyways, thanks so much for watching. See you guys later.